a lot, Hannah. One of the coldest places on the planet has long been a hot destination for researchers. Now, the North Pole is attracting more and more tourists. CBS News correspondent Jerry Bowen recently took a trip there to find out what awaits these adventurous travelers.
The North Pole is a very confusing place. First of all, there is no pole, unless you count Mike Kamieniski, one of 4 Poles from Poland we encountered, as they skied to their rendezvous with the historic spot.
You can feel the changes of the climate at the North Pole, especially at the North Pole.
No penguins to be found here. They live at the bottom of the world on the Antarctic coast. But there are polar bears atop an ever-drifting pack ice that makes it impossible to erect a permanent marker to the absolute top of the world. And because that ice melts and breaks up, man's presence is seasonal, concentrated largely at a Russian ice station known as Camp Borneo. Camp Borneo, safe to say, is like no other camp in the world, as it floats on the Arctic Ocean on 6-foot thick ice. And just getting to the top of the world is part of the adventure. 20 hours of flying in all, from our home base in Los Angeles, California, to Resolute Bay, Canada. From there, the final 6 hours in the sauna-like rear of a cargo plane for a bumpy landing on an icy runway 40 miles from the pole.
Socks, balaclava, more gloves.
Most of the ski tour groups come via Norway, a much shorter distance. And at a cost ranging from $13,000 to $23,000 per person, they get the pole and the hospitality of Christian Damaravai, the boss of Borneo. So it's mostly skiers.
Mostly skiers. It's a nicer way to discover what is the pack ice of Arctic.
What the skiers discover is a menu too modest to mention and abundant amounts of vodka to help one forget. And the accommodations are, well, camp-like. Heated, of course. With cots and sleeping bags for a dozen or more guests to snore the night away. That's another thing. This time of year, there is no night. It's all daylight all the time at Camp Borneo. A place where aging Russian cargo helicopters act like taxis, moving scientists and adventure travelers all over the top of the world. And where researchers and tourists alike are amazed at how much warmer the top of the world has become. How would you characterize this year for expeditions in the Arctic?
It's been the worst conditions that we've seen in years and years and years. Every year the ice is getting worse and worse and worse. Over the last 40 years, in fact, the ice mass has lost 40% of its density. And this is leading to the open areas of water, leading to thinner ice, creating pressure ridges, which make it much, much more difficult. When we think about climate change, some of us just think, great, we can get a tan in April. But out here, you can see it actually destroying the habitat.
But for now, it's still much more ice than open water, just not as much ice as there used to be. Scientists from the University of Washington, sponsored by the National Science Foundation, set up a small camp of their own at the pole each year to drill through the ever-thinning ice and drop scientific equipment. This year, the ice started cracking around their tents almost as soon as they set up.
This is our first year that we've had open water very close by. In fact, from what we could tell after it opened up, that we were almost surrounded by open water.
The remote North Pole isn't quite as remote as it used to be. Yet there's still adventure to be had, especially when the destination is a place called Camp Borneo. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, near the North Pole.
And tomorrow, Jerry introduces us to a group of women making tracks across the ice to the pole. We'll be right back. This is The Early Show on CBS.
The North Pole is called the last frontier for a good reason, as it remains one of the most inaccessible places on Earth. But CBS News correspondent Jerry Bowen recently went there and found a group of women willing to face the rugged and remote terrain.
It's known as the Great White North, the very top of the world, domain of legendary men, explorers to polar bear hunters, till now.
It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
Meet Corinne Cadell, part of the flight crew that took us north, and as far as she can tell, the first flight attendant ever to reach this historic destination.
I've been doing some searching around, actually, to try to find out if there has been one before, but so far I seem to be the first one to land on the North Pole.
You couldn't get the Bahama route?
No, I do those on holidays only.
And when she isn't checking cargo,
I'd like some coffee while it's hot because there won't be any in half an hour.
She's riding herd on her passengers. This reporter and a handful of scientists heading north to learn why the vast Arctic ice pack is getting smaller and thinner. Among them, camera-shy oceanographer Sigrid Salo. She's more at home on the ice, bare-handed and bloodied in sub-freezing temperatures.
It's not that bad if you just keep moving, no.
Installing instrument buoys that are carried by the always moving pack ice down toward Greenland, relaying data to orbiting satellites along the way.
Do you see yourself as any kind of a trailblazer?
No, not really. I'm doing what I enjoy doing, regardless of whether other people are doing it or not, I guess. I'm not really thinking of whether other people are interested in doing the same thing as well.
This piece of pack ice has one of the most famous addresses in world history, 90 degrees north. And it still means something to be here, though not as much in the days when lives, careers, and national honor were at stake in the race to be first to the North Pole.
I think that we're going to do it.
Now, it's a tour destination for people like Allison Levine, a 38-year-old San Franciscan who's also climbed Mount Everest and joined a tour group that skied the last 60 miles to the pole.
I mean, you have to be a little bit whacked, I think, to want to come here to begin with, but I don't know. I mean, I guess you can go to Hawaii anytime, or you can go to Florida anytime, and how often do you have the opportunity to go to the top of the world?
Levine got the extreme tourism bug after overcoming a threatening heart condition, figuring her personal clock was running.
You know, my expectations, I don't know why, but for some reason I was thinking that we would just sort of be cross-country skiing in really cold weather, and I wasn't expecting the extreme, like the physical demands of carrying a 100-pound sled over huge blocks of ice and having to, you know, take off your skis and sort of do a little bit of climbing here and there. And I have a lot of snow on my face. I wasn't expecting the drift. I mean, you could spend 10, 11, 12 hours trying to get across, you know, a big chunk of ice, and you go to bed and you wake up in the morning, and because of where you've drifted, you end up in the same place you were the day before. So it was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be, and there were definitely a couple of times where I thought we might not make it all the way to the North Pole.
But make it she did.
You're standing on the top of the world thinking, this is pretty cool stuff.
Joining that growing sorority who brought a woman's touch to the Great White North, making personal history along the way. For The Early Show, Jerry Bowen, CBS News at the North Pole.
Men first conquered the pole back in 1909, but it wasn't until 1971 that the first woman set foot there. Except for Mrs. Claus, of course. We'll be right back. This is The Early Show on CBS.
The Arctic is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. That's according to a scientific report due out this fall. Jerry Bowen traveled to the North Pole to see for himself.
These are times of disturbing change at the top of the world. In Resolute Bay, Canada, the jumping-off spot to the North Pole, winters are later, summers longer, and hunters frustrated by a vanishing ice pack, the habitat for the much sought-after polar bear.
Something's going on.
We notice something's going on, and the ice is a lot thinner than it used to be. And some animals that we see, they're getting more skinnier, more hungry because of too much open water.
1,000 miles away, very near the North Pole, American scientists are monitoring the ice pack to learn what's happening. Research funded by the National Science Foundation. Oceanographer Sigrid Salo is installing instrument-equipped buoys that will float on the ice as it drifts south toward Greenland, sending data to orbiting satellites.
They're associating the temperatures with whether ice is accumulating or being taken away.
At a temporary mooring camp, massive instrument arrays are deployed beneath the ice on a 2.5-mile-long cable anchored to the ocean floor. Warmer Atlantic Ocean waters are being detected. There's even talk of an ice-free Arctic by century's end.
The ice generally on the planet is the canary in the mine, and that canary is keeling over.
James Gustav Speth, environmental professor and author of Red Sky at Morning.
These are huge changes, and they're harbingers of much larger and more threatening changes to us.
Extreme field work for the scientists sometimes means extreme risk. Their field is an ice cap 6 feet thick, and sometimes the ice moves.
This spring, Russian scientists had to be rescued by helicopter after their North Pole ice station was crushed by shifting ice.
This is new. This just came up one day when we went to bed. That was flat. Woke up, it was all up.
American camp manager Jim Johnson has a rifle to deal with polar bears, but there's nothing he can do about an ice crack-up.
The two masses of ice come together, and it's like plate tectonics in hyperspeed. It just starts pushing up the ice.
Scary?
I
mean, is that the kind of thing when it pops up like that?
Yeah, it can be.
But it goes with the territory in a part of the world where researchers have much to learn about changing climate conditions and how this ocean and atmospheric mixmaster is shaking up weather patterns around the world. Jerry Bowen, CBS News at the North Pole.
While the political debate goes on over the causes and even the existence of global warming, scientists who've studied the Arctic for years say it's now clear that the heat is on. And they say the consequences of Arctic warming could be profound for everyone on Earth. CBS's Jerry Bowen went to the North Pole to get the inside story.
It's been a warmer than usual spring at the top of the world. And at a remote field camp near the North Pole, American researchers have been fishing for answers.
We've seen changes sort of concentrated at the pole over the last 15 years.
Each April, scientists funded by the National Science Foundation take advantage of a 3-week window when there's 24-hour daylight and temperatures hovering around freezing to probe the polar ice pack, an ice pack that's been thinning and retreating for several decades now.
The thing I'm becoming more convinced of is that conditions of the ice here really do affect the global atmospheric circulation.
In other words, less ice means more areas of warm water and pockets of warm air that are helping to change the global temperatures and wind patterns. As a result, one new study suggests that desperately needed storms will be steered away from the drought-plagued American West, drying it by as much as 30% more and increasing the wildfire danger. And what's triggered the change in the Arctic?
You've got a mix of something like an El Nino for the Arctic and perhaps some sort of global warming signal.
The talk of global warming is a double-edged sword for skeptics who don't believe it, but nevertheless are intrigued by the possibilities a warmer Arctic may bring, including an open water shortcut over the top of the world that may already be emerging.
1,000 miles away in the tiny Inuit village of Resolute Bay, Canada, life may be in for a big change. Some climatologists believe that when these kindergartners reach middle age, in just 50 years, the normally ice-choked bay will be part of a summer-long, ice-free Northwest Passage.
It cuts thousands and thousands of miles off the sea routes between Europe and the Orient and would be irresistible to commerce.
But Dennis Conlon, who helped write a recently declassified document exploring the military implications of a watery Arctic, says an open Northwest Passage makes America open to new threats.
We'd have to counter terrorism, we'd have to protect assets, we'd have to perform search and rescue. Every function that the Navy normally performs, we'd have to perform in the Arctic.
It's no longer a matter of speculation. The Arctic is changing, and if the climate change is prolonged, it will have global impact. The question on the table is whether man can or will do anything about it. Jerry Bowen, CBS News at the North Pole.
When Robert Peary led an expedition to the North Pole back in 1909, he personally took this picture of his team. Now as then, the top of the world beckons travelers in numbers Rear Admiral Peary could never have imagined. Jerry Bowen has sent us this postcard from the pole.
Welcome to the North Pole, the absolute top of the world where every direction away is south. A storied place which has been discovered again. Barely a century after man first claimed to have reached it, tourists are coming in by helicopter or on skis. Spaniards from Pamplona, no bull.
We are mountaineers since we were very young, and we wanted to make a new challenge, and we decided to come to the North Pole this year.
And Poles from Poland. It seemed a natural destination, Poles visiting the pole. They celebrated by playing soccer. It happens every April as planes start arriving at the temporary Russian ice station called Camp Borneo, landing on a runway that's been cleared by a vintage World War II tractor. Offloading American scientists with all their gear, they've come to figure out why the Arctic climate is changing so much, so fast. And tour groups. People pay around $25,000 to ski the last 60 miles to the pole, starting out from Camp Borneo and returning there roughly 10 days later to celebrate and drink Russian vodka.
Socks, balaclava, more gloves, more layers.
That's where we met Allison Levine from San Francisco. She's climbed Mount Everest, and the pole was next on her list.
I mean, you have to be a little bit whacked, I think, to want to come here to begin with, but I don't know. I mean, I guess you can go to Hawaii anytime, or you can go to Florida anytime. And how often do you have the opportunity to go to the top of the world? And
so Allison joined a British tour and discovered why those early explorers had so much trouble. The snow-covered trail to the pole is on drifting ice, and when it drifts away, sometimes several miles a day, so do you. And when it cracks, the sledding can really get tough.
I think it's going to be a good day. I think that I have a lot of snow on my face.
Hello. Here I am, out on my way to the North Pole.
American adventurer Wave Vidmar tried to do it the really hard way, skiing 600 miles all the way from Russia without any help, pulling a sled loaded with supplies, sometimes having to backstroke his way over open water to reach safe ice on the other side, and hoping he didn't become polar bear food, which nearly happened.
I just let the mother bear and her 2 cubs know that I wasn't going to be a snack or a meal for them.
How'd you do it?
I had my ski poles in my hand and I placed them on top of my head so that I'd become very tall all of a sudden. And also I was unpredictable so that she didn't know what to expect from me. And so I made a woo 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 sound and she backed away immediately. And then later I tried to call her back over so that I could get better pictures and better video. And she came.
We met Vidmar when a Russian helicopter came to airlift him off the ice. For a number of reasons, including that drifting ice pack, he had no chance of reaching the pole while conditions were still safe. He was getting farther and farther from it. The Russian cargo choppers are the taxis that run out of Camp Borneo. We hitched a ride on one with University of Washington scientist James Morrison to visit his remote base camp. The National Science Foundation pays for his research. Among other things, he's trying to find out why the ice pack is getting thinner and smaller, which didn't seem likely on the blustery day we talked.
And so the thought of an ice-free Arctic is, well, it's attractive for some things. If you want to get a ship across the Arctic Ocean, it sounds like a terrific idea. But it does indicate a fundamental change in our global climate. And it's a concern with any of the global warming scenarios.
Back at Camp Borneo, Carol Post from Boston would have welcomed some warming.
The Russians really know how to survive in this climate, and I don't think Carol Post could survive very well from Boston.
Carol's husband, who remained behind in Norway, somehow convinced her that a trip to the pole would be a wonderful adventure.
He owes me a big one.
Carol is a world traveler, just not to places like Camp Borneo with its sleeping tents, unheated outhouses, and no bathing facilities.
This place makes Mongolia look like Boston.
She arrived too late for the hot air balloon rides over the pole. The sled dog rides had ended too. So when she wasn't dozing on a cot in the dining tent, warmest place of all, she conducted her own tour, ogling the ice sculpture, visiting the helicopter crews, even inviting herself into the tents of the Russian workers.
Oh my God, you got running water? We don't have running water. Can I try it? Can I wash my hands? Wait a minute.
It was actually water from a can that poured into a wash basin. Water melted from ice the Russians chipped out of frozen freshwater pockets. A luxury at the top of the world, and one that put Carol in a very good mood.
Sweet. I think I could sell this place for you. I'm in real estate in Boston. This whole thing. Go for a lot of money, especially the running water.
Borneo is only a temporary floating ice camp. The weather extremes here, the warmer temperatures and unstable ice of summer, the total darkness and harsh winters make it nearly impossible to maintain a year-round camp. Soon, the Russians will pack up their tents and leave the ice until Borneo returns next spring.
But this year, there are memories aplenty for those who made it to the pole. Alison Levine got there on her skis.
When I think about geographically where I am, and at the very top of the globe, in the, the Arctic Circle, it's just insane to think about walking on the top of the Earth.
Adventurer Wade Vidmar made it too, by helicopter.
But I'm really happy to be here just the same. Yeah, it wasn't quite what I planned, but I reached my goal, and that was to come to the North Pole.
And that accidental tourist, Carol Post, found contentment too. Found the top of the world to be a beautiful place.
I feel like I'm on borrowed time here. I'm just a speck, one little snowflake. When I go home, I'm sure I'm going to tell people from years to come, well, when I was at the North Pole, and they'll sort of look at me weird, like, well, so what? But if they only knew.
Bragging rights, huh?
Of course. I've earned them.
She has indeed. She survived Camp Borneo and stood on the very top of the world, one of Earth's rare adventures. And yes, you can be sure, when she gets home to Boston, Carol's husband is going to hear about it.
This is, of course, summer vacation time when many Americans looking to beat the heat head north. Some, as CBS News correspondent Jerry Bowen reports, are heading way north, as far as you can go.
It's one of the most famous addresses in the world, 90 degrees north, the North Pole, and it's getting crowded. Visitors arriving by helicopter and on skis.
Here I am. Glad to be here.
American adventurer Wade Vidmar tried to do it the really hard way, skiing 600 miles all the way from Russia without any help, pulling a sled loaded with supplies, sometimes having to backstroke his way over open water to reach safe ice on the other side, and hoping he didn't become polar bear food, which nearly happened.
Yeah, I had my ski poles in my hand, and I placed them on top of my head so that I'd become very tall all of a sudden. And she backed away immediately.
So why do people come so far to stand at the North Pole? For those who really work to get here, it's a sense of accomplishment. But for most everyone, it comes down to a matter of bragging rights.
Oh, I made it! Thanks to you.
That's what lured Alison Levine from San Francisco, the former deputy campaign finance director for Arnold Schwarzenegger. She's climbed Mount Everest, now can put a check by the North Pole, having put down $23,000 to join a British tour group that skied the last 60 miles to reach it.
Well, it's one of the #1 vacation destinations, isn't it? Now, I've been wanting to go to the North Pole for a while. First of all, just because it's considered to be one of the most difficult to reach destinations on the planet.
Difficult? That's an understatement if you ask Boston real estate agent Carol Post.
Be honest with me. Your first impression?
Vast, and what am I doing here?
Carol was convinced to take the Champagne Special, a Russian helicopter ride to the pole, by her husband, who stayed behind in Norway.
He owes me a big one.
And that meant staying in a tent at the Russian ice station known as Camp Borneo, about as far from tropical and comfortable as Carol's ever been. But she will go home with bragging rights.
Come, do it, but bring a little food.
And a sense of humor helps too, especially when your spouse says, "Honey, have I got a trip for you?" Jerry Bowen, CBS News at the North Pole.
Where you feel on top of the world, part of our world tonight.